It's hard to take the legitimacy of the U.S. Supreme Court seriously when you consider some of these decisions that I discussed today. It was like every week, here's an anniversary of the Supreme Court taking rights away from people.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Closing out the month of January, I wanted to take a few minutes to share some of the January anniversaries in labor history. As with every month, I compiled this information primarily from the 2022-23 edition of Planning to Change the World, a plan book for social justice educators. This excellent planner is published by the Education for Liberation Network. I want to make sure I give them full credit. Shout out as well to the Zen Education Project, which is another great source. You can check out their This Day in History post on social media, hashtag TDIH. Definitely follow those. You know, those of you who are regular listeners know that I'm much less online than Jacob, but for those of you who are into that kind of thing, check out hashtag TDIH for some great stuff from Zen Education Project. I tried to focus on labor issues primarily in these anniversaries. So we're going to start out, though, with January 1st. It was the 160th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation becoming law. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in September 1862, became law on January 1st, 1863. Of course, the proclamation only freed slaves in the Confederate States because Lincoln was wary of antagonizing those southern states that had remained loyal to the Union. Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery, but questioned the constitutionality of abolishing it outright. Eventually, he came around and paved the way for the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the U.S., except for certain situations, as you're well aware. So while the proclamation was arguably a more symbolic decree than a practical one, it was a transition point where the Union war effort became further entwined, not just with preserving the Union, but abolition of slavery inside that Union. And for that reason, it's worth remembering. January 3rd was the birthday of Lucretia Mott, born in 1793 and living until 1880. Mott was a white activist in the women's rights and abolitionist movements. Offended by the exclusion of women from the anti-slavery movement, she helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention to address women's rights and abolition. She later became the first president of the American Equal Rights Association, an organization aimed at achieving equality for women and African Americans. January 5th was the 120th anniversary of Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock. Kiowa Chief Lone Wolf sued Secretary of the Interior Hitchcock, claiming that Native American tribes had been forced onto reservations under the Medicine Lodge Treaty and that they had been defrauded of their land by the acts of Congress in violation of the treaty. In a disgusting decision, the Supreme Court held that Congress could unilaterally nullify treaties between the U.S. and Native tribes. The consequences were predictably devastating for the tribes. Another reminder of the anti-human legacy of the U.S. Supreme Court and the imperialist oppression of our indigenous brothers and sisters. January 5th was also the 100th anniversary of the Rosewood Massacre. After a white woman wrongfully accused Jesse Hunter, a black man, of assault, local white men launched a manhunt and lynched another black man, Sam Carter, for allegedly assisting Hunter's escape. After several nights of tension and violence between the black and white residents of Rosewood, Florida, on January 5th, a mob of 200 to 300 white men went on a rampage, killing 30 to 40 black men, women, and children, and burning the town to the ground. January 11th is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day. The goal of this day is to raise awareness of and vigilance for the millions of human trafficking victims around the globe, with the aim of eradicating this insidious crime. And we often hear about human trafficking in the context of crime and, sex workers and things of that nature. But let's not forget that human trafficking is taking place across the world and is unfortunately prevalent in industries across the world. I know one of the most high-profile examples would be the cocoa and chocolate industry, which, my understanding, has historically relied upon child labor and human trafficking to complete that labor. January 13th, 1893, saw the birth of the Independent Labour Party in Britain, with James Keir Hardie as its leader as they sought to advance working-class candidates in Parliament and build a labour politics outside the middle-class Liberal Party. January 14, 1868, the South Carolina Constitutional Convention met with a majority of black delegates, adopting a constitution that provided for all people regardless of race, economic class, or gender. It was a progressive document written in the aftermath of the Civil War, when in 1868 state constitutions across the South were rewritten by both black and white delegates. In the years that followed, Reconstruction was prematurely ended, with Northern industrialists and the federal government abandoning the South to the reactionary, anti-democratic violence of the former planter class. In state after state, brief periods of interracial governance were at times gradually and at other times sharply ended by white supremacist rule. But it's a good reminder that often in American history we tell the story as if it's just a steady slope upwards of progress, right? That we're always just marching forward in progress. And that's not quite true. We move forward, we move backwards, and on and on. It's not necessarily this straight line of progress, because we saw true progress, or at least the potential of it, in the aftermath of the Civil War, only for those hopes to be dashed away. January 16th was, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the federal holiday at least. It's observed on the third Monday of January, around the time of King's birthday on the 15th. Martin Luther King Jr. was not just a prominent leader in the civil rights movement and an Alabama icon for justice. He was a dedicated friend and champion of the American labor movement. Someone who was dedicated to opposing militarism, empire, poverty, and bigotry, right? We often forget about Dr. King's anti-war work, his work on behalf of poor people and on behalf of the labor movement, and it's worth remembering. January 17th was the 130th anniversary of the American overthrow of the Queen of Hawaii. I won't try to pronounce her name and make a fool of myself, but it was the overthrow. Recognizing the strategic and economic value of Hawaii, a group of Americans and U.S.-born Hawaiian citizens staged a coup against the independent kingdom and established a provisional government with Sanford B. Dole as its president. U.S. President Cleveland tried to restore the Queen to power, but stopped short of overthrowing the illegal Dole government. Ultimately, Hawaii was officially annexed to the U.S. in 1898 and became the 50th state in 1959. Indigenous Hawaiians are still fighting for equal rights. That wasn't the only American coup on that day, unfortunately. January 17th, 1961 was the execution of Patrice Lumumba, democratically elected Prime Minister of the Republic of the Congo. The coup, backed by the Americans and the Belgians, is arguably one of the most significant Western interventions in Africa during the Cold War era. It's one of those great what-ifs, at least in my mind, and when we look at world history, and particularly in Africa after the during the Cold War. What if Lumumba had not been murdered and had been allowed to rule in the Congo with his democratic mandate? It's one of the most interesting what-ifs out there for me in more contemporary history. So I want to send solidarity with all peoples exploited and oppressed by the forces of empire. On that note, January 18th was the 80th anniversary of the first Jewish uprising in Warsaw Ghetto. The German military entered the Warsaw Ghetto, planning to deport a portion of the population. The residents believed the Germans were planning to deport everyone in the area. This time, the Germans were met with armed resistance. This urban uprising in German-occupied Europe resulted in a new sense of hope for the Warsaw Jewish population and sparked rebellions elsewhere. 230 years ago, on January 21st, 1793, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, King Louis XVI of France was guillotined on the charge of conspiring with foreign countries for the invasion of France. During the Revolution, the king had attempted to flee to Austria for assistance. 10 months later, his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was also guillotined. Just a reminder to what happens to elites who get a little too big for their britches. January 22nd is the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. This landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision determined that women had a constitutional right to an abortion. Nearly every state outlawed abortion at the time, except in limited circumstances, leading more than 1 million women each year to seek illegal, unsafe procedures. The justices drew on the 1st, 4th, 9th, and 14th Amendments in making their decision, which has been at the center of an ongoing debate about a woman's right to choose what happens to her body. We mark this 50th anniversary months removed from the Supreme Court gutting abortion rights under Roe and renewed crackdowns on abortion rights by right-wingers across the country. Sad to see us moving backwards on this front, and I hope some of what we saw in November's election in places like Kansas and Kentucky indicate that there will be an electoral backlash to these anti-choice politicians. January 22nd was also the 140th anniversary of the Supreme Court striking down the Force Act. The Force Act, commonly known as the Ku Klux Klan Act or the Civil Rights Act of 1871, sought to extend federal protections to African Americans in states where racial terror and violence ran rampant. The act was applied to indict Sheriff R.G. Horry and 19 accomplices for the unprovoked beating of 4 black men. The court's decision struck down the Force Act, leaving black Americans even more unprotected from pervasive racial terrorism in the South. January 23rd is the 60th anniversary of the arrest of Patricia Stephens Dew. Patricia Stephens Dew was arrested for setting foot in the whites-only section of the Florida Theater in Tallahassee, Florida. She began fighting segregation laws at a young age and participated in many student protests throughout her early life. At one protest in Tallahassee, Stephens Dew was tear-gassed in the eyes by police, causing permanent damage to her sight. Stephens Dew continued her fight for social justice and civil rights throughout her life. January 26th is the 160th anniversary of the authorization to recruit black troops to the Union Army. Prior to January 1863, black troops, both free and enslaved, were not permitted to fight for the Union Army. Shortly after Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, the governor of Massachusetts was given permission by the U.S. War Department to recruit black troops. However, while black troops began to form new regiments for the Union Army, they were consistently led by white officers. On that note, a little fun fact, it's believed that the first integrated fighting unit of Americans, led by a black officer, was actually not in the U.S. Army at all. It was in the International Brigades over in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. So shout out to Oliver Law. Many consider him to be the first black officer to lead an integrated American fighting unit. January 27th is the 50th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords. Signed by South Vietnam, the U.S., North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, the Paris Peace Accords marked the formal end of the Vietnam War and U.S. military involvement in the region. U.S. troops did begin to withdraw. However, the war continued until 1975. More than 58,000 American troops died in Vietnam. It's estimated that between 1 to 2.5 million Vietnamese died during the conflict, along with hundreds of thousands of Cambodians and Laotians. And of course, the criminals responsible, from Richard Nixon to Henry Kissinger to Lyndon Johnson, never faced any consequences for their crimes. January 28th is the 60th anniversary of Harvey Gantt's enrollment at Clemson University, becoming the first black student after the university was ordered to admit him by the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1963. January 28th is also the birthday of José Martí, the Cuban poet, philosopher, and freedom fighter, born this day in 1853. He fought for Cuba's independence from Spain. He also argued against the threat of U.S. expansionism into Cuba. In 1869, Martí founded the newspaper, which he published many of his poems in. He was arrested in Havana and deported to Spain, where he published his pamphlet, Political Imprisonment in Cuba. In 1895, he returned to Cuba to fight for its independence and died on the battlefield. January 29th is the 160th anniversary of the Bear River Massacre. U.S. volunteer soldiers attacked a Shoshone village on the pretext that they had attacked white settlers in the area. In fact, the settlers had stolen all of the land and water from the Native Americans in the area. Initially, the destitute Shoshone were able to hold off the soldiers, but the battle soon devolved into a massacre with mostly unarmed men, women, and children being slaughtered indiscriminately. The Shoshone death toll has been estimated at between 300 to 400, compared to 14 casualties among U.S. troops. And finally, January 29th is the birthday of Thomas Paine. Shout out to friend of the show, Professor Harvey J. Kay, who is a Tom Paine scholar. Kay argues that Paine's radical democratic impulses have continued to inspire Americans for the fight for progressive change over the past couple centuries, and I know he would be disappointed if he wasn't included in this month's labor history anniversaries. So a little light this month on the more traditional labor history stories, such as strikes. Some of that we can just chalk up to timing. It was some weird anniversaries. For example, the monumental Bread and Roses strike started 111 years ago this month. Kind of an odd anniversary. There were a lot of important anniversaries, obviously, when it comes to race, when it comes to the violence of white supremacy, state oppression, and imperialism. In particular, it's hard to take the legitimacy of the U.S. Supreme Court seriously when you consider some of these decisions that I discussed today. I mean, it was like every week, here's an anniversary of the Supreme Court taking rights away from people, or condoning violence against people. It's hard to take the U.S. Supreme Court seriously when you think about that history. So, just want to encourage folks to continue looking at labor history and to learn from our history as working people. As working class people, we have our own rich history of struggle, and it's worth remembering. And remembering our struggles for interracial people power here in the South and across the nation and the globe.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.